Peter Brimelow, author of Alien Nation. What's the general thesis of your book?
Oh, Brian, just that immigration is out of control. The immigration was triggered, mass immigration was triggered again by the 1965 Act. Nobody expected the numbers would be as large. They didn't expect that it would be dominated by just 15 countries, which is what's happened. They didn't expect that the skill levels would deteriorate sharply because of the perverse level the Act works. And they just had no idea any of this was going to happen. But of course, once it happened, it's become a sacrosanct subject and people are afraid to discuss it. The country is being transformed against its will, by accident, in a way that's unprecedented in the history of the world, to no visible economic gain, incidentally, and you're not supposed to talk about it, so of course I couldn't resist.
9% of the 260 million people that live in the United States are foreign-born?
Right.
Are they citizens?
No, not all of them, no. I think about a third are citizens. Matter of fact, half of them have told the census that they can't speak English. 45%, I think.
Why should they speak English?
Well, it goes to the question of, are they creating enclaves? And are they, in fact, assimilating to the national community? You know, a nation-state normally, essentially requires a common culture and a common language. I don't see how it's going to work without it. So the country's coming apart ethnically under the impact of this great wave of immigration. It's an amazing spectacle.
What's wrong with that?
Well, my general take on that is what's right with it. And this has all been done by public policy, so the people in favour of it have got to show what the purpose of it is. But to make a suggestion, is this one nation indivisible? I mean, we're creating here societies which are going to be as different as any on the face of the earth. They're going to be different racially, they're going to be different culturally, because there's no, you know, we have multiculturalism now, we don't have Americanization that we had in 1900. And they're going to be different linguistically, because we now educate in the different languages, and language retention is very high among some groups, particularly the Mexicans. So is this going to hold together?
What did you find when you got there?
Well, you know, I found all the illegals standing at the border, actually over the border, because the US has fallen back from the border to try to a more defensible line, waiting for dark and shouting insults at the border patrol. And then as soon as it becomes dark, you can see them on the scopes, the infrared scopes, start to swarm across. In the early part of the night, they catch quite a few, but by the end of the night, it's just completely out of control. We could show it on the network news, actually. I mean, because it happens with absolute clockwork regularity.
What would you do to stop it?
Well, I think there should be a physical barrier, for one thing. There was no fence at all there until quite recently. The citizens of San Diego took to driving down to the border and lighting it up with their headlights so that the Border Patrol could see these people. It's a scandalous situation. This is a profoundly powerful issue once it gets into politics. It's a party breaker. If the parties don't respond to it, people will form new parties, which is what they did in the 1840s. There's no more powerful issue in democratic politics than immigration.
Looking to 1996, what role is the immigration issue going to play, in your opinion?
Let me answer that question twofold. What I was saying there, as you know, Brian, is that voting patterns in this country are determined by ethnicity. In the book I say, and I've got in trouble for saying, that race is destiny in American politics, but this is no more or less than the political science reality. That ethnicity is more important here than class, which is important in Europe. The only white group that votes heavily for Clinton is the Jews. A minority of the whites vote for Clinton, but he does carry a majority of all the minority groups, with the arguable exception of the Asians, but their voting is so low that it's hard to tell what's going on. And, you know, this is a profound division in American politics. The Republicans carried the Congress this last time, basically because they were able to become the party of the white majority. And this is the reality. What's happened is that the whites seem to have tipped, and blue-collar workers and so on have migrated out of the Democratic camp and into the Republican camp. And it's a very disturbing thing. I mean, politics do operate on racial lines in this country, which is why, if you muck about with the racial balance, you are altering the political future of the country.
You say this: if the immigration pincers continue to close on America, the Clinton administration's electoral coalition may be a harbinger of politics to come.
Sure. I mean, the only way in which Jesse Jackson is ever going to become president here is if the Rainbow Coalition grows to the point where it can outvote the whites. That's basically what it comes down to.
What's wrong with that?
Well, my view is what's right with it. I mean, you have to go to the whites and tell them this is going to happen because of public policy. It's not going to bring you any economic benefit in particular. You're also going to lose political power. Are you in favor of this? I think that, you know, it's not that easy to force people who are very different by nature to live together. And that's really what government policy is doing right now. I mean, immigration, for example, is one aspect of this. They're bringing in people who are very, very different from Americans and telling them not to assimilate. And that imposes enormous costs on native-born Americans. And that's why, for example, Americans, generally speaking, are leaving California at such a tremendous rate at the moment. It will ultimately cause tremendous political turbulence.
What do you mean by electing a new people?
Well, that's derived from the famous poem that the German communist poet Bertolt Brecht, he was a dissident communist in East Germany. He wrote it in 1953 after the East German risings against the Soviet occupation. And he said that maybe the government should dissolve the people and elect a new one. Because the people weren't behaving properly according to what the Communist Party thought they ought to be doing. Now that's literally what the governments throughout the Western world are now doing. They've set about dissolving the peoples and electing new ones by bringing in vast numbers of people from very different communities of the Third World and so on. And it's very closely tied up with neo-socialism, because what it does is it creates problems which the government is then called in, or feels called in, to solve. It has to intermediate, it has to have all kinds of race relations laws and anti-hate crime laws and all this kind of thing, because of the frictions that is important to the community. So from the point of view of the government, it's great, these people are clients. But from the point of view of the people, it's catastrophic, because they've been displaced. I think white Americans generally, implicitly and without being fully aware of it, and you see this in the Tea Parties, are organising themselves because they feel under attack by current policy.
Would you consider the white response to be an organic response?
Organic in the sense of natural,
yes.
Yes, I think it's just inevitable, it's inexorable. They've been presented with a situation which has taken them some time to figure out, but they will eventually start to organise themselves in terms of their own interests. How could they not?
Now I want to say, to emphasize here, that I haven't given up on the idea of patriotic immigration reform, of immigration being cut off. All it takes to get this issue into politics is one speech. In Britain, and a number of English people in the audience will testify to this, the impact of Enoch Powell's speech in '68 was absolutely enormous. And it did stave off mass immigration for a generation. It took, I mean, he was denounced, of course, but at the same time the politicians were too frightened to really act on it in a big way until Blair was elected. That's when the floodgates really opened in Britain. Similarly, you know, the communist infiltration issue, which was a real issue, really got going after MacArthur's speech in 1950 in Wheeling, West Virginia, which suddenly something can happen, a spark which starts the conflagration going. That could still happen. In both cases, in Powell's case and in MacArthur's case, you can see the preconditions already forming. All it needs is a spark, and all it needs is one ambitious politician. The nightmare scenario, of course, is South Africa. That the historic American nation, the nation that had evolved by 1965, and it's not exclusively a racial term, it's an ethno-cultural term. Will be so paralyzed by white guilt, as Richard said, that it will never defend itself. It's like one of these grubs that gets stung by a wasp, which then proceeds to lay its eggs on the grub, and the eggs hatch and the larvae eat the grub alive. One of the unpleasant facts about biology that I've learned from my 4-year-old child, the girl was very interested in biology. That's what the nightmare scenario is.
I'll actually be very gentlemanly and I'll ask my opponents a question. What exactly do you expect to happen through the political system in the foreseeable future? What do you see as a possible outcome that would fundamentally alter the fate of the white race in the North American continent?
Well, exactly what happened in 1980. You'd have a president elected who broke radically with the consensus, and you would, among other things, cut back on immigration, and it would have more profound effects than anybody realizes. So the answer is a second Reagan. I don't know whether that's going to happen, but it could happen. And you know, there are a lot of people at the time when Reagan came into power who didn't take him seriously. But in fact, I think his effect was tremendous.
How was Reagan's immigration and race policy? Could you remind me about those?
His immigration and race policy consisted of winning the Cold War and stopping inflation. Immigration was not an issue then, but it is now. That was then, this is now. It's a different issue, so you have somebody who focus on these new problems. To put this in context, this was mid-April, the conference last year of 2015. It wasn't completely clear that the congressional Republicans were going to cave in on their campaign promise to reverse Obama's executive amnesty. But it was fairly clear. And that was very bad, because it meant there'd be no longer any conceivable chance of stopping the left's drive to elect a new people. Somewhere in the decade after 2040, federal immigration policy will reduce American whites, that is to say, the people who before the 1965 Immigration Act were actually known as Americans, into a minority. And America won't survive without them, which is why I'm worried about the future of my children. So I'm going to take the liberty of reading out what I said last April to give you the argument that lay behind my assertion. To quote me, I said, I want to emphasize, I've not given up on the idea of patriotic immigration reform. We call it patriotic immigration reform to distinguish from the other kind of immigration reform that seems to have hijacked what we used to call amnesty, of immigration being cut off. All it would take to get this issue into politics is one speech. Well, this is why I'm rich and famous. In fact, it didn't even take a speech. It just took a soundbite, a few sentences in Trump's declaration announcement. Is anybody here from Washington State? Right. Well, you know that, you know particularly that there are reports right now that there are so-called earthquake swarms gathering around Mount Hood in Washington State. And that's another eruption that may be imminent. Another eruption may be imminent. It gets everybody's attention because of the huge mess that the 1980 eruption caused. Well, there have been earthquake swarms around the immigration issue in the US dating back to more than 20 years. Jared and I and others have been saying for more than 20 years that the American political order is built above an increasingly stressed seismic fault. But the political elite, left and right, just went on building. Now they've got Trump. They deserve him. Well, the second question, of course, is can we trust Trump? And the answer is absolutely not. You can't trust any of these characters. It's entirely possible that he could be another Schwarzenegger, that he could be content to reign rather than to rule. But we don't really know what he's going to do when he gets into the White House. Well, as I said a year ago, it will only take one. I said a year ago it would only take one speech. My prediction this year is that it will only take one election, and then Mount America will really blow. Thank you very much. I think that America is the center of the world. American politics is the greatest show on earth. The entire world is watching. If he wins this election, it's going to send an absolutely tremendous message everywhere. And I think that a lot of politicians, people will come out of the woodwork. People will come out of the woodwork all over the world. Because this stuff is not popular, you know. Now, what this also means is there's going to be a hell of a fight here. Because what Sam Francis used to call the evil party is determined to suppress this movement with whatever method it can. And that's why so many of you here today are here pseudonymously. It'll be a hell of a fight, but if he wins, it will turn around quickly. I can't overemphasize how important this is. The 2016 election was, as Mike Anton called it, the Flight 93 election.
It was a desperate attempt, like those people in the plane that went down in Pennsylvania on 9/11, to get control of the flight or die. That was what had to be done. There was just no alternative. We have a totalitarian left in this country, a totalitarian left. We saw them outside today. And they really believed that they were on the brink of knocking out the historic American nation, the American nation as had evolved by the time of the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened the floodgates after a 50-year pause. They were going to do it with this final surge of third world immigration. They were going to import enough demographic change to make their election irreversible. Anyway, as I say, it's not that Trump is ill, but the country is. It's in crisis. Its institutions are buckling under the stress of this irrepressible conflict between the historic American nation on the one hand and what we call anti-America on the other. You know, the Democratic coalition, which is fundamentally made up of minorities and immigrants, and which is struggling to take control of the country. There are two nations warring in the bosom of one state, and the institutions are buckling under the strain. Plus, you know, Trump really was a revolution. It was a hostile takeover of the party. He actually tried to placate them after he took over. That's why he chose Pence as his vice president, which may well prove to be a fatal mistake, because it makes impeachment more attractive to them. That's why he had Reince Priebus in there. But the party is not reconciled to him. And of course, above all, is a hostile takeover of the entire state of the permanent government, which doesn't want to go in the direction which he's talking about in any way. It wants to continue immigration. It wants to continue to intervene militarily. It wants to have it all over the world. It wants to have free trade. You know, one thing about Trump, you know, is his campaign was a high-concept campaign. There were a lot of ideas in it, actually. They just weren't ideas that the mainstream media and the ruling class like. The thing about a society like Iceland, though, is you can always change. The problem with diverse society, diversity is not strength, it's weakness. And one of the forms of weakness is political debate becomes much more fraught. It's much more difficult to take certain positions if people are divided on ethnic lines and always looking for ethnic grievances. I think you could pull out of it in Iceland. It's very difficult to do that in the US. And that's why I think ultimately the US will break up, I'm sorry to say. I mean, I regret it, but it's a result of bad policy, and it's going to be difficult to unwind. Thank you.
Thanks very much.